he was very, very successful financially. His son decided.
I was just wondering, how did Sam Azies
get his money?
Right.
Sam Azies came here to Woodbine as a little boy with his mother and his grandparents. His grandparents were very strict Orthodox Jewish, and his mom had him, and his father was not Jewish. His father was Syrian. So in the course of life, something happened where Mr. Azies kind of disappeared. So Sammy and his mother wound up back with her parents in New York. They were looking for some kind of employment opportunity, and they had heard that Woodbine, this was in the 1930s, they had heard that Woodbine had factories and farms, and in fact, there were advertisements. They used to advertise from this community in the New York newspapers, in the German-speaking newspapers, the Yiddish newspapers, and the English newspapers. Why work in the sweatshops of Manhattan when you could come to the wide open spaces of New Jersey? Because at its height, believe it or not, Woodbine had 19 factories here. And the reason factories were successful is because there was a railroad. And so the rail was able to move the goods to Philadelphia and New York. Without the railroad, the factories would never, as you understand, the factories would never have been successful, because how would they be able to manufacture their goods? And then in those days, we didn't have big tractor trailers that were traveling cross country, moving goods and food to major cities. So Sammy's grandparents opened a rooming house and a bakery. And when he was a little boy, he was very mischievous, he was very bright, and done oral histories with people who knew him as a little boy. And for instance, some of the immigrants didn't allow their children to play with him because he always got in trouble. Now, there were chicken farms here. This was not a chicken farm community originally. This was primarily founded as an agricultural community. It was an experiment that the Baron de Hirsch Fund wanted the immigrants that they brought from Russia, primarily from Russia, by the way, because Russian Jews were so discriminated against and lived lower than dirt. They weren't allowed to own any land of their own, and they always had to go into the Russian army, and they were very seriously discriminated against. So the Baron de Hirsch Fund was developed to help bring immigrants out of those conditions and bring them to America for the same reasons that all of our ancestors came to America, for, you know, economic and religious freedom, etc., etc. So Sammy was he was brilliant when he was a little kid. I mean, he was the one who gave the medicine to the chickens on the farm. The older men would call for Sammy to come to help assist them with all kinds of very complicated things. So when he was 12, he opened a bicycle shop. He was very mechanically inclined. He was a very bright student, and he graduated Millville High School. There was a high school here until 1943, the year I was born. And so now you know how old I am. And the high school closed, and from then on until this day, the students who graduate from the Woodbine Elementary School matriculate to Millville High School. So Sammy graduated from Millville High School, went on to Rutgers and on scholarship, and then to Temple University for his graduate work. And I am told by people who knew him in doing oral histories that particularly in his chemistry courses and his lab courses, the professors, they depended on him. He was so unusually bright. Well, after he got finished school, He went to work for RCA, which was at one time a huge manufacturer. Well, they were a pioneer in television, for instance. RCA doesn't exist anymore. It feels horrible to say that, but RCA no longer exists, and all that technology that we have mostly comes from Asian countries. But he went to work for RCA, and he and I believe 3 other men in his department discovered how to replace the ticker tape on Wall Street. If you ever saw old movies or old black and white movies of things on Wall Street, there was a he invented the mechanism that was a time release mechanical mechanism that replaced the ticker tape. Now, that was huge. That's how he made his first million. After that, he was smart. He was an investor. He was a very plain person. And he invested his money. He bought property. He bought property all over Cape May County, and then in Atlantic County as well. And he was a farmer. He and his wife was the secretary to the superintendent of the Woodbine school. And they had 4 children, and they lived in Woodbine, and then they moved to Tuckahoe, where they lived for the rest of their lives. And his wife still has the house in Tuckahoe. And they were farmers. And she said in the summer, she drove the tractor, and Sam and Michael Aziz, his son, ran alongside and threw up the bales of hay onto the tractor. So, with all of that said, he went into the cell phone industry because somebody said, "Sam, have I got a deal for you?" And the deal, back in the day, you kids wouldn't know this, but I remember even the first cell phone I ever saw, I suppose I was about 12 years old, but they used to be a monstrosity. And he went into the cell phone industry mainly in the southern and western states where there was no cell phone. There were no towers for cells and so on. And he made a lot of money in that industry. Then he came forward to the East Coast and partnered with some other people and became a real multi-millionaire through the cell phone industry. Now, in probably about 14 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, before he passed away, he sold his cell phone business to the largest satellite provider in the world. And when he did that, he became a billionaire, as you could understand. So, all of that money, he was very philanthropic. He never forgot. I mean, Sam used to come to Woodbine all the time. He rode his bicycle. He would ride a bike 50 miles a day. And he used to come to Woodbine, especially on Tuesdays and Thursdays, to have bean soup at Dionysus down the street. And Dionysus is just a plain, ordinary little restaurant. It's our only restaurant in Woodbine. But, you know, he never became that ostentatious, pushy, materialistic person. He was very philanthropic. So when he passed away, his son decided that they should do something to honor his memory. So this originally started as a museum of Jewish history, and then they realized they made a big mistake. Because in an area like this, and when you develop a museum, how do you just isolate it to something? It could be the Museum of Polish American History or Jewish history, but who's going to come? So they decided they should really look at the very unique history of Woodbine as a community and create a museum that encompasses the whole multicultural history of the community. And that's really what this community was about, and even today is still about. So it became the Sam Aziz Museum of Woodbine History. And the floor, when you walk around, and we have student groups here, they're always very excited, especially the young ones, because they see the names of the streets of Woodbine. And I tell them that when the original immigrants came, as in most stories you hear about immigrants who are so happy to be in America, they named the streets after presidents. So that's why we are on Washington Street. And you'll see Adams, Madison, Monroe. There's no Quincy Adams Street here, but the kids always want to know, is there a President Clinton Street? Is there a President Obama Street? And then I say to them, no, that's modern history. We're going back 100 years. But, so the floor has the names of the streets, and the panels which depict by decade, really, and by generation, the beginning of the community, and then they try to tell the story. This was originally developed as like a museum where you would come in and just look at everything, and then, but I decided when I came along and when Nora and Eve came along, which was about a year later, oh, we've got to be able to become historians here. We have to learn about this community, so that the panels are great because they are historically accurate. But the real stories are the stories that we have learned through our historical searching, our oral histories, and there's a difference between fact and urban legend, we know that. So if you talk to 5 people who know something about Woodbine's history, you may get 5 different stories. But basically, you will always get the same thing, and this is what is so impressive to me, that this community, as I said, started originally as a fully Jewish community, became very multicultural, and was always a harmonious community. There's a 5th generation Afro-American woman here who is very well educated and runs a business in this community, who told us that when she was a kid growing up here, her next door neighbors were Jewish on one side, and on the other side they were Hispanic. And they slept over, they ate dinner at each other's houses, and there were times when, if one didn't have a party dress for the occasion for Sunday, the Caucasian family would lend the dress to the Afro-American family. There was always a harmonious environment here. She said when she grew up and graduated from Millville High School and went to Rutgers, that's when she really discovered the persecution of minorities, because she had never ever experienced it here, and it was a real slap in her face.
Which was Rutgers in New Brunswick.
Rutgers in New Brunswick, yes. So what we developed here as a museum was a mission statement, which is based on tolerance, and that when you leave today you can all have a tolerance bracelet, because what I've learned as what we know about the end of the 19th century and the great wave of immigration into this country, which brought both sets of my great-grandparents from 2 different countries, and brought many, many, many people who were coming here for the reasons we discussed before, economic, religious, social, a much better way of living. Since that time, this community represents not only Jewish history, not only Afro-American history, not only history of survival of any group that would come into a place that had nothing. There was nothing here. When they came, when those poor 61st souls got off the boat and found their way down to Woodbine, there was nothing here. There were trees. There was a little shack by the railroad track. So they had to literally cut the trees and go through and create the town. Now there were specific plans for this community that were arranged through the Baron de Hirsch Fund, which provided the money to bring the immigrants, the Hebrew Immigration Society, which is called HIAS, and the Jewish Agricultural Society. Those groups were dominated by very wealthy New York Jewish businessmen. And they were benevolent enough to put some Philadelphia Jewish businessmen on their board. So these men who were very well established and very wealthy were also into the philanthropy of trying to save their brothers from the persecution and the poverty that they were experiencing, particularly in Russia. But eventually we got